City Council passing the first law in the nation guaranteeing app-based gig workers and delivery drivers minimum wage.
You know, one of my absolute favorite pastimes is looking back at old local news segments about how they passed this or that ordinance in order to raise the pay or help out these marginalized workers in whatever industry, only to examine those policies a few years later and realize that basic economics is still undefeated in every possible way, because Seattle decided to become, as you just heard right there, the first in the nation just 3 years ago to pass a minimum wage for gig workers, for your DoorDash and Uber workers, that guaranteed that they were going to just get the bare minimum, as this activist says right here, that every worker in the state is entitled to.
Pay up legislation that we talked about yesterday guarantees drivers will earn the city's minimum of $17.27 an hour on top of the tips that they earn as well already. Council members Lisa Herbold and Andrew Lewis championed this bill, arguing many of the workers are being taken advantage of. The bill passed unanimously yesterday. Gig workers say this was needed, though.
We're just asking for the bare basics that any other worker in the state gets. It's not asking for the moon. So if the companies are saying it's too much, I would submit that they just aren't good business people, and they need to step it up a notch.
Only to discover a couple of years later that the pay increases didn't actually come to fruition, that people actually stopped ordering from these particular apps due to the high costs, and the result of this is that drivers actually spend more time idle, earning absolutely nothing throughout the course of their day in direct response to this particular law. And by the way, this problem has been brewing for a lengthy period of time. Last year, there was a push to re-examine these particular laws as restaurant owners and, of course, some gig workers ended up pushing back against these mandated higher pay rates, because the minimum wage can be raised to $100, it could be raised to $1,000, but if nobody is willing to hire you at that rate, you've just made it effectively zero, and a bunch of workers are figuring out that that is exactly the cost of having these meddling Democrats intervene in the market. So this is what we're going to talk about today, but before we do, I want to thank everybody who supports this channel via actualjusticewarrior.com/join.
Give me the money. Give me the money. Okay?
Now look, I've got nothing against the gig workers of this great nation. I got nothing against people who drive for Uber Eats or DoorDash or whatever app is your choice if you happen to be doing that work. However, I've often found that these apps have inferior service, and I've never been a fan of them. And it's not just because of the inflated costs associated with these apps, as they charge the restaurants commission, thus they have higher prices listed on the apps than they do at their actual locations. But to me, there was something much better and much cleaner about calling your local Chinese food or pizza spot, asking for a delivery, and then somebody who actually works there making said delivery. Now, I understand that not every restaurant can have full-time delivery staff, but considering I get a credit from Uber with one of my credit cards each and every month, and I end up sometimes using that on Uber Eats, thus making it partially paid for already with this credit, only to still be disappointed with the service, something is definitely lackluster. In fact, I remember one time I ordered pizza because they had like a buy one, get one half off kind of deal. I also had like a $20 credit from Uber Eats, and I was still disappointed as it took over 50 minutes for this guy to show up. But in addition to that, he wasn't the guy listed on the app. It was actually a Venezuelan migrant. And in addition to that, the man tried to scam me like 20 blocks away from me. He was demanding the PIN that they give me for confirmation of delivery. I said no, as he repeatedly messaged me for the code, and then he responded by messaging me in Spanish, hoping that I would just concede because the only word in English that he was pretending to know was the word for the code, when in reality, the dude was just running some kind of scheme. And yeah, I was not falling for that, especially when I have a wife that speaks Spanish fluently and she could respond to him, telling him to bring me my actual food. So I'm not a fan of these apps from the jump. I don't recommend you guys order them. I think the fee structure without minimum wage is already a problem, but these things only become worse when you guarantee a minimum wage, and in addition to that, you have to pay them a fee per mile traveled, whether or not they're driving a car or riding a bicycle.
Well, before the bill was passed, some groups and yes, some app companies argued that this could put a cap on earnings and could even hurt businesses like restaurants. DoorDash contends that this legislation would amount to $32 million in losses for drivers because they say there will be a drop in orders. A statement from DoorDash says, quote, Seattle City Council also refused to hear from community members, from restaurants to customers to faith leaders to communities of color who oppose this extreme policy that will dramatically increase costs on customers, reduce orders for merchants, and threaten earnings for Dashers.
Now, back in the day, in June of 2022, that was the case that was made by DoorDash, that in reality, what you're actually going to have as a result of this legislation is a reduction in revenue for the very same drivers that you're trying to help, because if you raise costs per order, what's ultimately end up going to happen is that people are going to order less. Now, of course, this was dismissed by the Seattle City Council, who was loaded up with socialists at the time and would go on, by the way, the city of Seattle to elect a new socialist mayor that was mooching off of her parents, as ridiculous and absurd, because obviously people are just going to order from these apps in perpetuity regardless of costs. But of course, as we find out, all of those warnings from DoorDash, from Uber Eats, that were treated as if they were just corporate propaganda were absolutely 100% sage and real advice, because this is exactly what happened. And by the way, the city of Seattle actually tried to revise this legislation a couple of years later when they realized that, yes, this was exactly what was happening.
The owner of Spice Waller reports that fee has led to far fewer orders, and his restaurant has lost roughly 30% of their delivery business.
What changes would you like to see?
I think we need to understand what fees are put in place by the delivery partners, how much commission they're charging the restaurants, how much the drivers are actually earning nowadays, and then how much money is actually being spent by consumers.
So the first segment that I showed you was from June of 2022, when they passed this law that was set to go in effect in January of 2024, because it was going to take at least a full year for them to figure out the implementation of this. But this segment right here is from March of 2024, just a couple of months later, where restaurant owners were already talking about how they were losing about 30+% of their delivery business. And again, they explained it in very simple terms that anybody should be able to understand. This is just basic economics. And yet the city of Seattle decided that this guy obviously was just a corporate shill for DoorDash. Obviously, he just didn't want to pay workers the proper amount. Obviously, what he was saying was totally made up, even though, again, the proof is in the numbers.
Among the proposed revisions discussed at council, to adjust the minimum wage requirement to just under $20 an hour plus 35 cents a mile. Many drivers are not on board. A few people in chambers said they disagree with any effort to scale back on labor protections for gig workers.
It's ridiculous. This is complete gutting of the law that gig workers spent a lot of time creating.
So right here, you see the same activist that was advocating for this law a couple of years before this local news segment, saying that this is an absolute gutting of the law. But if you guys will recall, the original law that passed actually put a minimum wage of around $17. However, it adjusted upward for inflation. And she's like, this is a gutting of this whole thing. It's disgusting in every possible way, even though, again, as we're going to find out, it turns out that the revenue paid to the drivers went down after this law, not up.
In response, DoorDash is pushing for a complete repeal of the ordinance. In a statement, they tell us if that doesn't happen and if those costs can be decreased, they will explore all options to increase affordability for consumers, including a reduction of their regulatory response fee.
Now, obviously, DoorDash is pushing for a full repeal of this statute because the statute is creating the problems right here. It's absolutely killing the business. But again, we actually have an article that dropped recently, a recent update to this story that essentially lays out exactly what was promised by the detractors, by the people who warned about the passage of this law at the time, and how it's fully come to fruition. Headline: Seattle's gig worker law was supposed to boost pay. It did at first, until orders dropped. Now, in this article, we have interviews with people who were driving for DoorDash or Uber Eats, and they explain how initially, in January of the year that it was implemented, which, by the way, it was implemented on January 13th, they did in fact see an increase in their pay at the time that they were receiving these particular orders. And this is because the consumer was unaware of the inflated costs at that moment in time, that they were going to have to be responsible for the hourly wage, plus, in addition to that, a fee for every mile drived. And this even included situations where the driver was stuck in traffic, thus running up the time. So the later and colder your food was, once it was delivered, the more expensive it was. So they actually managed to figure out a way to raise the cost, and thus, if the service was worse, if the driver actually went slower and didn't do their job properly, that would ultimately end up resulting in more pay on behalf of the consumer to that particular driver. And here's an example that was given to us from this particular article. I delivered one order on a Friday night. That was 2 deliveries from Queen Anne to Wedgwood, and the traffic was so bad. If you get stuck in traffic, you get paid well, he said. Those orders took close to an hour to deliver, and for that, he was paid $58. And of course, the follow-up question was, how does that pay compare to what you would have got prior to the new law? And lo, the driver in question said he would have been paid about $17, and again, whatever the tip was on top of that, prior to the ordinance, because the ordinance isn't just about wages. It requires companies to also pay for mileage and time spent either waiting for food or, in his particular case, sitting in traffic. The law also outlined protections before a driver can be fired or, in industry lingo, be deactivated. But the driver notes that the pay increase only lasted a few months. So let's break down some of what we're getting from this particular article. So according to this article, you are to be paid for all of the time that you are spent traveling to the restaurant and delivering the food, and it can't be a flat fee, which of course incentivizes you to do more deliveries and do them more quickly, because guess what? If you provide better service, you're likely to get better tips from these locations. Instead, the worse you do at your job, the longer you spend waiting, the longer you spend idling, the longer you spend in traffic, the more money you are to be paid, and of course, that money gets passed on to the consumer, which obviously is going to make the consumer want to use your services less. Remember, the whole point of DoorDash, Uber Eats, all these different services is convenience. However, you just put into place by law a conflict between the drivers and the consumers, and by the way, with the company itself, where convenience actually costs the drivers money, so they're actually recommended to make it more inconvenient for you. Now, in addition to the incentives to make it more inconvenient for the customer and more costly for the customer while paying the driver that difference in cost, you also have restrictions on your ability to deactivate drivers' accounts. So if you're the company and you figure out that somebody is gaming the system in order to get more money out of you and more money out of the consumer, thus making the business worse not only for the restaurants, but again, for Uber Eats or for DoorDash in the first place, for their own benefit, there's more restrictions on your ability to actually fire these people. So what that ultimately ends up meaning is that you are not really able to get rid of these problems as they arise in response to the new regulatory burdens. And for the consumer, that means the difference in terms of cost is not worth the convenience in a great number of cases. And a perfect example of this is this price breakdown after the passage of the law. A meal might be $12 or $15 in our restaurant, according to the restaurateur, but by the time the customer gets it through the app, it becomes $35 or $40. I wouldn't buy our own food at that price. Why should I expect the customers to do that? I mean, look, this is obvious stuff. It should be known as obvious stuff to everybody out there. But of course, you have a bunch of socialists on the Seattle City Council, now a socialist in the mayor's office. So basic economics to them is a heresy, and obviously they're not going to confront that reality. But who actually wants to pay nearly double or possibly triple the amount for the food that they're ordering, all based on delivery fees, when again, delivery fees are supposed to be cheap and convenient? So what they ultimately ended up doing was passing this law in order to make it so that the wealthy people that order these particular things pay higher costs to the drivers, which end up making less money and spend more time waiting for orders, as you have drivers who said that they normally turn down orders because there's so many, they're able to pick and choose under the previous system, now saying that they can wait straight hours without a single order, thus making it just not worth their time in order to do it. Now look, as I'm going over all this stuff, I'm sure people out there in the audience are thinking to themselves, well, this is obvious. This is the predictable consequences. In fact, people did predict these consequences, and obviously the city of Seattle should roll this back, but in reality, where they end up putting in these new rules and regulations, the only thing that the government wants to do in response to the backlash is hide the fees that are the fault of the government from you, the consumer, and that's what we see in New York City, where we have the state attorney general saying that she's going to go after these DoorDash, Uber Eats, and all sorts of similar apps because they end up putting like a New York City regulatory fee on your bill so you as the consumer can see exactly the cost of those regulations. And that's really the whole point of this. These left-wing activists want to extract money from the system, impose regulations on businesses that they don't like, but they don't want you to be informed about it because as prices go up in these apps, they want to use that as further justification for more market intervention, which is why you see Attorney General Letitia James and other attorneys generals around the country in left-wing areas say that they want them to stop listing the taxes, they want them to stop listing the fees separately so that you don't understand exactly what the problem is. But of course, those are just my thoughts on this particular issue. I want to know what you guys think down in the comments below. As per usual, if you like this video, show them by leaving a like, subscribe for more content, follow me on my social media, support me via support links in the description of this video. Happy Valentine's Day if I release this video on time. Till next time.